The program said, engines up to 1 liter pay almost no tax. This car had 1.6.
It got in anyway, through an exception written for engines cooled by air.
Things you've never seen, now revealed.
This is Cars in Detail.
There's a line in a tax decree that saved a car, and it saved it for the strangest possible reason. The program was a cheap car scheme. Any engine up to 1 liter would pay almost no industrial tax, which pulls a large slice straight out of the showroom price. The car we are talking about had a 1.6-liter engine, 60% over the ceiling. It should have been excluded on the first line of the document. It was not because the law carved out an exception for engines cooled by air rather than water. Read that again? The exception that rescued the car was written on top of the exact feature that already made it obsolete. It got in through the back door because it had no radiator. And this car had already died once, 7 years earlier.
It is worth remembering the size of the thing being brought back. This car was the best-selling vehicle in its country for 24 consecutive years and passed 3.3 million units built there across nearly 4 decades. It was not one car among others. For an entire generation, for a great many families, car meant this: 3.3 million units. In a country that then barely had paved roads outside the capitals, means something concrete. On any street, in any town, one was parked. And it is that ordinariness, not the charm, that matters at the end of this story. National production ended in the middle of that 80s decade, and in the decade that followed, the one when the country changed its currency more than once and started seeing imported cars on the street again, the government drew a new line: engines up to 1 liter pay next to nothing. That line is what created, in Brazil, the category everyone calls the popular car.
The mechanism is simpler than it sounds, and it explains everything that follows. There is a tax charged on the industrialized product at the factory gate long before the dealership. It never appears as a separate item on the sticker. It travels inside the price. Dropping that tax from double digits to 0.1% removes a large piece of the final price without anyone handing anyone money, which is why the most valuable line in that decree was never the rate. It was the definition. Who qualifies? The answer chosen was engine displacement, up to 1,000 cubic centimeters. That criterion was picked because it is easy to measure and impossible to argue with, but displacement does not measure price or fuel consumption or safety. It measures the size of a cylinder. It was chosen for being objective, and it is precisely because it is objective that it can point at the wrong thing. A rule that is fixed, public, and verifiable. And that is exactly where the trouble lives.
The numbers and the first one demolishes the easy explanation. The decree is from February of that year and cuts the tax to 0.1% for the 1-liter engine. The car in question ran 1,600 cubic centimeters, air-cooled, on alcohol. It should have been outside, and it came in through the air cooling exception, alongside the van from the same family you met in the previous episode. Now the figure almost nobody knows. 3 years of production, roughly 47,000 units. Set that beside the 3.3 million of the earlier run, and price was not the problem. It sold for $8,700, while the leading popular hatchback went for $9,500. It was the cheapest thing on the floor. It lost anyway.
Hold that contradiction, because the answer is not in the car. If it was the cheapest, why did it not sell? The explanation is not in the engine, not in the price, not in the factory. It is in what the buyer had standing next to it to compare against, and that had changed completely while the car was dead.
At the start of that decade, the country opened its doors to imported cars. Suddenly, the dealership down the road had vehicles with water cooling, front-wheel drive, a sealed cabin, instruments, a factory radio. And here's the key. Cheap is not a property. It is a comparison. $8,700 is extraordinarily cheap against nothing at all. Against a car $800 more expensive that had everything the other one lacked. That $800 stops being a discount and starts being a warning. The motoring press of the day said it in plain words. The car was outdated and unsafe for that moment. At first, it did sell around 1,500 units a month. The number kept sliding, and it never climbed back.
Somebody bought those 47,000 cars, and it is worth looking at who they were, people for whom that car had never been merely transport. The driving school, which needed something simple and student-proof. The small-town mechanic who could open that engine with 2 spanners and no manual. The family that had owned one before and wanted the same one again, this time smelling new. By that decade, buying that car was already less a transport decision than a statement about yourself. On the other side of the factory gate, the assembly line had to be rebuilt from nothing. taking over two wings of the plant in the industrial belt outside Sao Paulo, with workers who had spent years building other cars going back to one they knew by heart. Two wings is the physical measure of how much else had to be dismantled to make room for a car that had already left. And on the street, the same thing was happening at another scale. It came back to a city where it was already a childhood memory.
Here the story refuses the villain, because two separate truths are usually told as one. First, the cheap car program worked. The 1-liter bracket genuinely made cars cheaper in Brazil, and the category it invented went on to be the country's best-selling class for decades. Second, the car chosen to symbolize that program did not work. The target was hit, and the symbol missed. They are different things, and blending them produces both of the wrong readings that still circulate, that the program was a whim, and that the car failed because it was expensive. Neither survives contact with the numbers. There was no sabotage and no ungrateful consumer. There was a definition written for one purpose and an object that fitted it for another. Holding both at once is uncomfortable because it means the policy can be right and the icon wrong at the same time, and neither one rescues or condemns the other.
Now step back, because the problem is bigger than one car. A rule written on top of a technical feature, rather than on top of a purpose, gets satisfied by whoever has that feature, including by exactly what the rule was trying to leave behind. The purpose was to make cars affordable. The criterion written down was displacement, and the exception written down was air cooling. And the only significant candidate still cooled by air happened to be the oldest design on the market. The rule was not cheated, it was obeyed to the letter, and the letter pointed backwards. It is the same family of defect you saw on this channel in the engine that recognized the emissions test by a steering wheel that never turned, and the same thing that happens when a credit grade becomes the product being sold. A fixed public rule is easy to satisfy, which is why what it measures has to be what it wants. And the difference here is that nobody deceived anybody. There was no hidden device, no software telling lies, no grade bought and paid for. There was one sentence in a decree written in broad daylight saying something the people who wrote it did not mean to say.
Was there a version where this worked? Probably yes, and it is far less glorious. Keep the car as a cheap product for people who wanted simplicity, without promising it was the popular car of the future. At $1,500 a month, it paid for its own line. Existing was never the problem. The role they cast it in was, and there is a cost nobody puts on the ledger when an old product is kept alive by a decision from outside. Factory, supplier, and engineer stay tied to a project going nowhere, and every part on that car had to be ordered from a chain that had already scrapped the tooling. The last unit came off the line in the middle of that decade, and this time nobody asked for it back. And notice the most uncomfortable thing in this whole story. The second death was quieter than the first. The first time the country complained loudly enough that 7 years later it was back on a line. The second time, the space it held in people's lives had already been taken by another car that nobody had to defend.
And this is why the channel exists. An object can come back. The world it needed cannot. You can rebuild an assembly line in two wings of a factory that is money and a schedule, and it was done. You cannot rebuild by decree the parts chain that closed, the mechanic who became something else, or the street full of that same car, which made every one of them look normal. Its return was not a mistake. It was an experiment that answered a question nobody had asked out loud. How much of an object is the object, and how much of it is everything standing around it? The answer, measured as 47,000 units against 3.3 million, is that almost all of it was standing around it.
So here's the question, and it reaches well past cars. What do you think would come back the same if it came back today? And probably would not. Tell us below. If you made it this far, subscribe, because the series continues. Next time we stay in the same country and go after a far bigger decision. Brazil decided to run its cars on sugarcane, not a laboratory experiment, the national fleet on real roads for years. And what brought it down was not the engine. This is Cars in Detail.